Welcome back to UC University, Christians in the Workplace, Class 1, a Biblical Theology of Work. This is Part 2. If you missed Part 1, you can always go back and see it on our YouTube page by searching for Union Church Rio, Union Church University. The next thing we see is Act 2, Fall. But of course, this isn't a real story until something happens to throw everything off balance. And that brings us to Act 2, the Fall. We don't know how much time elapsed between the day Adam got his first job and the day that it all went wrong. But what's clear is that one way of understanding what theologians call the fall is that Adam and Eve fell down on the job. Remember, they were entrusted with the garden to steward it, to guard it, and on both counts, they failed. Satan shows up, the enemy of God and humans, and instead of protecting the garden from him by throwing him out, they have a conversation with him. And by the end of that conversation, instead of stewarding the garden, they try to use it for themselves, abusing their own authority and ruining it for everyone else. Right away, they know they've blown it. The boss, God, shows up to inspect their work, and they're hiding in a back office somewhere. Now, we all know what it's like to get a subpar performance review, and some of us know what it's like to get fired. But what Adam and Eve get is worse than either of those. They're kicked out of the garden, but they're not relieved of their responsibility. They're still accountable to represent God. They still must work, but the conditions of their work have radically changed. The world they work is now cursed because of their sin. In Genesis 3:17 through 19, three things happened to Adam and Eve's work and to ours because of the fall. First, it becomes toilsome. Through painful toil you will eat all the days of your life. This is so basic to our experience of work that it's hard to imagine what work must have been like before. After all, even a job you love has at least some aspect to it that's tiresome, tedious, or even painful. We know what needs to get done, but we either lack the ability or the resources to do it, like there's some conspiracy to make our work hard. There is a conspiracy. In a fallen world, work is toilsome, but it's not just toilsome. Second, it becomes futile. Even though Adam will painfully toil the ground his whole life, the cursed ground under his feet will produce thorns and thistles for you and for me, and we'll eat the plants of its field. Futility, fruitlessness, his aspirations will constantly outstrip reality, and try as hard as he can, they will never change. Inside the garden, the result of work was the expansion of paradise. Outside the garden, our work never produces utopia, not even close. The very ground is cursed. What we find is that these two aspects in a fallen world, that it's futile and toilsome, run smack up against the assumptions of the modern world. As Tim Keller observes, our generation insists that work be fulfilling and fruitful, that it fully fit our talents and our dreams, and that it do something amazing for the world, as one Google executive described his company's mission. Sounds great. The problem is that's not the world we live in. So we're tempted to give up on work entirely, to grow cynical or to opt out. But that's not really an option, because there's a third thing that happened to work at the fall. What had been a free act of worship, now it becomes compulsory for survival. Verse 19 says, "By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken." In the garden, Adam did not have to work in order to eat. God had planted an orchard, and everything Adam needed was there for the taking. But now there's an urgency, a compulsion to work. As Paul said, "If a man will not work, he shall not eat." It's not that work has become bad. It's not that work is a punishment. It's that in a fallen world, toilsome, futile work is relentless. Like it or not, we must work. We cannot escape it, except in death. Genesis 3 is Act 2, Scene 1, in the fall. But the crisis in the story is not just about the change in our work conditions. It's also about a change in us, the workers. In a fallen world, fallen workers no longer use their work to worship God, but to worship idols instead. Act 2, Scene 2, one of the first pictures of work we're given outside the garden is the contrast between the descendants of Cain and the descendants of Seth, the son of Adam who replaced Abel since Cain killed him. And what we see is that work builds culture. Cain's descendants develop agriculture and music and metalworking, and all of that is really good. But what the narrative also tells us is that the descendants of Cain are defined by their work. Their identity comes from their work. In contrast, the descendants of Seth, the godly line, aren't associated with work at all. Instead, they are defined as those who began to call on the name of the Lord. The point isn't that worshipers of God don't work, but rather they aren't defined by their work. This is the idolatry of work, which comes into sharp focus as the story marches on. In Genesis 11, we read, "Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, 'Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly.' They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth.'" Just like in Genesis 4 with the descendants of Cain, the work here is ultimately culture building. They develop technology. They build a city. They're pursuing human flourishing. That's all good, but they want something else too: identity. They want to make a name for themselves, and they want to do it apart from God through their work. And in fact, they want to do it in a contradiction to God. God said to fill the earth. Their desire is that they be not scattered over the face of the whole earth. How far from the garden have we come? What began as a means of saying, "Look, God," in worship, has become a means of saying, "Look at me." The image bearers have become curved in on themselves, as Augustine put it, seeking to reflect their own glory to themselves rather than God's glory back to Him. And I want you to see that this idolatry has at least two different and sometimes simultaneous expressions. On the one hand, some of us are tempted to define ourselves directly by our work, our accomplishments, our success. On the other hand, others are tempted to define themselves by their freedom from work, their leisure, their hobbies, and their recreation. But the two are really just the opposite sides of the same coin. An idolatry that defines our identity by our relationship to work, rather than to God. The end of the Babel story is that God comes down and judges their idolatrous worship of work. And that same judgment is what all of us deserve. But praise God, that's not where the story of work ends. Let me sum up this with our second lesson, lesson number 2. The problem with work is a lost connection between God, worship, and work. Sometimes it's that we reduce work and don't see it as worship of God. Sometimes it's that we idolize work and worship it, and ultimately ourselves. Instead of seeing it as an act of worship of the true God, we've lost work as worship of God. We'll pause right here and pick up where we left off next time we're together. Thanks for joining us for UC University, Christians in the Workplace. Stay safe. See you later. See you soon.